Welcome to the Times of Israel's Lazar Focus. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with not Lazar, here with Haviv Rettig Gur. Lazar is in the United States with our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And so Haviv is in, and we are kind of babysitting the Lazar Focus this week, Haviv. So Haviv, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here, Amanda. Lazar is having fun in Miami while we have to go through the cold rain of the Jerusalem hills.
That's right. Life is so unfair. But Haviv, I mean, as a man who has his own named podcast, it might be a little strange to have somebody else hosting Haviv Knows Everything, or what's the name of your podcast?
Ask Haviv anything.
I know, I'm just
But
kidding.
luckily, Haviv gets to choose the questions, so, he doesn't, he sounds like he knows everything because he chooses what to answer. That's the important thing. That's the key. If you're starting your own podcast, make sure you get to pick the topic.
100%. And one day I aspire to having my own podcast named after moi. But in the meantime, I'm so
Aren't you
happy to be
deputy
here.
editor of the Times of Israel in charge of all the podcasts?
Yeah, I know, and I actually picked all the names, so it's my own
You could have
fault.
this, Amanda. This is a choice.
One day,
Okay.
one day. In any case, Haviv, thank you so much for joining me on the Laser Focus. And I actually gave you some homework. So, listeners, we are going to hear about Haviv's very own projections for 2026. This is the year we're about to enter as we're recording and will have entered when this has been released. Haviv's projections for Israel for 2026. So, we're going to dive into them when we're back.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. I am Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. And Haviv, I am so glad to have you here just so I could clear my throat and get all the phlegm out from winter with my
Yes.
rish. But
We're going to get
anyway,
emails.
we're going to get emails. We always get emails. But you know what? Laser is away, and so we can have a little fun. So here we go. We are going to dive into your projections for 2026. And they're projections, but they're also challenges. And before we actually take them one by one, just very briefly, Haviv, when I gave you this homework assignment yesterday, what was your first response? How did you search your mind to come up with this list?
All of it is obvious. If you asked anybody, what scenario? I think you asked me. Technically, the question was, give me 5 scenarios. And I couldn't limit it to 5. I ended up with 6. But we know the challenges Israel will be grappling with in the coming year. And then the question is, what do you think it's going to do with those challenges? How important are those challenges? What kinds of how central will each challenge be? And I think that 2026, if I were to wrap up all these challenges together, whether it's the economic dangers, Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, etc., it is that Israel is going to now have to, in 2026, develop the long-term management of this new reality. It's a new defense reality. It's a new economic reality. And how we manage it in the long term and how our institutions handle it in the long term is going to determine whether we flourish in a slightly more dangerous and slightly more difficult and much more expensive period of our history, or if we slowly decline and weaken. And so it's going to be the year where we make that decision.
Okay, and it is so fitting that you did 6 projections for 2026, so thank you for that. And let's just start with the one that seems the most realistic to me, and that's the grinding escalation in the north. As we are recording, we are on the brink of a deadline that was set out of disarming Hezbollah south of the Litani River. There are claims made by the Lebanese army that that has indeed happened. However, Israel is not happy with the status of the armament and the renewed attempts to build up Hezbollah along Israel's northern border. So tell me what you are thinking when you're talking about some grinding escalation in the north, Haviv.
The most important thing to understand is the foundational Israeli strategic understanding of what's happening in Lebanon. And as with October 7 or October 8, it's profoundly informed by Gaza. So on October 7, the Israelis discovered not that Hamas is bad or that they'll kill us as soon as they can. They discovered that Hamas actually sought this kind of destructive war in Gaza. They built the unprecedented tunnel system so that they could literally sit and eat and be safe and happy and have electricity and air conditioning under Gaza's civilian population for 2 years. And, as we've said 100 times, not a single Gazan child has been allowed to step foot into those tunnels in 2 years. In other words, Hamas planned as their foundational strategy to impose costs on Israel this war in Gaza, this deeply destructive war in Gaza, and in fact is willing to go to round 2 right now, and round 3, and round 6, and round 40. And that means that Hamas is undeterrable. You cannot, with firepower, deter an enemy for whom the destruction of their own polity is seen as their actual strategy for imposing costs on you. And then Israel looked at Hezbollah and it said, we thought that Hezbollah was deterred. Yes, it was constantly expanding an arsenal that may have grown to 200,000 missiles and rockets, and many of them precise by the time October 7 happened. But they were clearly deterred because they hadn't carried out a major operation. But they certainly were training to carry out a major operation, and they were constantly building up, and Iran was spending billions on them. And then we looked at Hezbollah and we said, wait a second, what if they're Hamas? What if not only are they undeterred, but the damage that such a war would wreak on Lebanon was part of their strategy? They sought that self-destruction. And that is exactly the kind of Islamist ideology that they have. They are fighting a war for the redemption of Islam in the world. They believe that, what if they believe, like Hamas believes about Gaza, that Lebanon is a worthy sacrifice to lay on the altar of the destruction of Israel? And that means they're undeterred, and that means that every asset they have, they're going to use. And therefore, it has to actually be taken out. Israel today looks at Gaza and says, 2 years of that war, and Hamas can still rule half of Gaza the day after. 2 years of that war, they come out of the tunnels. Now, they were saved. The last major tunnel system is under Gaza City, and the leveling of Gaza City on the scale of Rafah probably would have decimated that last. There was still a little bit in Deir el-Balach and a few other places, but at the great last battle, the Trump administration squeezed out of the Qataris and Hamas the full front-loaded return of all the living hostages, and the Israelis couldn't say no to that deal. And that saved Hamas in their major underground bunker. But nevertheless, here we are with Hamas still alive 2 years in. Israel having incurred all the costs of that war. Obviously, I'm talking about strategic military costs, right? The humanitarian costs were mostly incurred on the Gazan civilian population. We're here talking strategy rather than, the human cost of the war. Well, what if Hezbollah actually isn't so removable if we're modeling them on Hamas? And what if Hezbollah, whatever the Lebanese army says about Hezbollah being disarmed south of the Litani, it's all a fiction. Everybody wants to pretend like there isn't a problem. And under that desire of everyone, the Americans and the Lebanese and the Arab world, to pretend there isn't a problem, we already know Iran has sent $1 billion into Lebanon. So under that pretense that there isn't a problem, we know for a fact that, Israeli intelligence is telling us, deeply believes and is preparing for the fact that Hezbollah is already beginning to recuperate its arsenals and its manpower. And so Lebanon, the problem isn't going anywhere. And the Israeli posture in Lebanon is to assume the worst at every opportunity and assume that every rocket and every Radwan Force fighter who remains alive in Lebanon is going to be used against Israel. And so you fight it now or you have to fight it later on their terms. And so we have to expect in Lebanon escalation. It simply doesn't make sense not to. Hezbollah only wants a war. It doesn't want anything else, and it's willing to destroy Lebanon for that war. And Israel assumes that Hezbollah only wants a war and doesn't want anything else and is willing to destroy Lebanon for that war. We're talking about continued airstrikes. We're talking about a possibility that under cover of the Lebanese army, the places the Lebanese army claims it has cleared of Hezbollah are actually places that are more difficult for Israel politically to conduct airstrikes, which means that those are the places that are safer for Hezbollah. So specifically, I was going to say dafka. In Hebrew, we have a word dafka. I don't know how to translate it. So specifically in those areas, ironically, that's where we have to expect Hezbollah to find its footing, to start to rebuild its capabilities. and pretty soon to start to explain that it still exists, especially if, under the massive international pressure, the state of Lebanon makes real moves to contain and diminish and suppress Hezbollah. And then
I
Hezbollah
want
is
to
going to have to
drill
show.
into this idea a little bit because you're juxtaposing the two terrorist organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, quite rightly. And of course, at essence, they both want to eliminate Israel. But the fact is that Lebanon is ruled by its own, national body. It does have its own army. It is not ruled by Hezbollah, at least anymore, and fully at least. Whereas, of course, the Gaza Strip is, or it appears to be, ruled by Hamas. So the fact is, yes, there is international that pressure that can be placed on the Lebanese government because there is a government. And don't you think, Haviv, that the Lebanese people themselves are tired of being bombed and being, having their homes destroyed because of this terrorist organization that has taken root inside of their nation?
If we focus in on the question, what would it take to remove Hezbollah? There is nothing in Lebanon capable of doing it. Not Lebanese public opinion, not the Lebanese state, not the Lebanese army. Under the umbrella of total and grim and bitter Israeli determination and constant airstrikes and constant intelligence activity and constant suppression, everyone else has this room to maneuver where they try and do their little bit. But no, the only real factor that matters on the ground is Israel, and the only reason anyone else has the political capacity, the president of Lebanon, the prime minister of Lebanon, can make these comments that they've occasionally made, that really Lebanon needs one army, one gun, one state, a monopoly of violence, and order again, and all this Iranian intervention. Hezbollah in South Lebanon is just as much the reigning ideology, never mind actually the organization, as Hamas in Gaza. Among the Shia of Lebanon, there are very few other political factors and factions. And Hezbollah is the only one that still takes in money and support from Iran. And nobody else has that scale among the Shia of Lebanon. So, no, among the Shia of Lebanon, we're dealing with a very similar situation. And only Israeli willingness is what's giving the strength, the backbone to everyone else. If that goes away, we will discover to our shock and surprise that the state of Lebanon actually has no capacity to stand up against Hezbollah, even now, even in its very deteriorated state. So expect escalation, expect a stalemate, but a stalemate that is very comfortable for Israel in the sense that Israel is free to continue to operate against Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is still entrenched enough and probably will be for quite a few years. There's no reason to believe that we're changing the fundamental order that is now underway, that is now present in Lebanon. And with any luck, over time, Hezbollah will be the loser. And that combination of Lebanese desire, Lebanese willingness to act, backed, propped up by the Israeli determination that Hezbollah never returned to what it was, over time, that could be enough to make Hezbollah not a worthwhile prospect for the vast majority of Lebanese Shia. But that's the hope.
Okay, so number 2 touches on what you spoke about already. We're talking about a stalemate in Gaza, which your projection is that it will continue in some kind of permanent and terrible way. Terrible for all involved, obviously, both Israelis and Gazans. And Israel, at the same time, has to decide if it wants to continue with this policy of containment, which we were so happy to, feed into this illusion that it was possible to do this for so many decades. So, Haviv, tell us a little bit more about this idea of a ongoing, permanent stalemate in Gaza.
The yellow line, the line that divides the Israeli-controlled 53% in the first piece in the phase 1 of the Trump peace plan, which is where the Israeli army is redeployed right now in Gaza. So beyond the yellow line is Hamas territory, and inside the yellow line is IDF-controlled territory. And the yellow line will remain fundamental for some time to come. I don't want to take too much credit for this deep insight. The Israeli chief of staff has said this publicly. The yellow line will be a border for, I don't remember how he phrased it, but the foreseeable future or something like that. And in fact, it reflects Israel's understanding that it's not at all clear who gets Hamas out, who disarms Hamas. They're absolutely unwilling to do so. The Trump plan lays it out so clearly and explicitly that Israel is on firm ground, unless, of course, it loses the support of the Trump administration on this point. If Hamas is allowed to retake Gaza and pressure is brought on Israel to fulfill its requirements for phase two, but Hamas doesn't have to fulfill its requirements even for phase one, then that would be worse for Gaza. Right now, Gaza is in a stalemate that Hamas is unwilling to blink. No amount of Gazan civilian suffering, no amount of, frankly, just the loss of the potential good that could happen, never mind the actual active suffering of the Gazan civilian population. Gaza has natural gas. Gaza has $100 billion out there in the world ready to come in out of sheer sympathy. Gaza is waiting for somebody to push that button, to pull that trigger, and probably pull that trigger is a bad metaphor, but to push that button and get for Gaza vast, rehabilitation, rebuilding money, including some of it from Gaza's own natural resources. Gaza could be rebuilt, rehabilitated, and become a prosperous emirate on the Mediterranean fairly quickly, and just about everybody wants it. As long as it is disarmed, as long as the de-radicalization is real, the Israelis want it. And so if everyone on earth wants it, why isn't it happening? And the answer is Hamas won't disarm. It won't give up its guns. The Islamist war on Israel, that forever war for the redemption of Islam, that war by factions that have bombed every peace process, not factions that demand Palestinian independence, but factions that demand the destruction of Israel. And Palestinian independence alongside a Jewish state of Israel, for them, would be a catastrophic, historic, spiritual setback because Zionism will have pushed Islam back. And so those people, i.e. Hamas, hold Gaza in their grip. And Gaza is unable, because of that, to duck out of the Islamist forever war with Israel and is condemned to remain the front line of that Islamist forever war with Israel, a war because that's Hamas's overall agenda that totally unites the Israeli left and right, that totally unites the Israeli body politic in a way that convinces most Israelis that they don't have a better option. They don't have another policy solution. And because they believe that, they're immune to international pressure on that point. Hamas unites Israelis and condemns Gaza. Even, by the way, if you love Hamas and agree with Hamas, just the strategic dynamic. I'm speaking to everybody. I'm speaking to people in the Muslim world. The strategic dynamic forced onto Gaza by Hamas means that Gaza has no path out of being that front line of the Islamist war on Israel. And Gazan civilians are going through right now a rainy winter. We just joked about, the rain of the Jerusalem hills. Gaza's tent encampments have seen very cold nights and flooding. We're going to see over the next 5-10 years, if there isn't a rehabilitation and a rebuilding process, a human tragedy playing out that even though it'll be slow and even though it will be, piecemeal, it'll be on the scale of the actual war at its most intense moments, meaning the deaths from exposure, the deaths from preventable diseases, just because there isn't infrastructure, because 1 million people are living in a tent encampment. That is Gaza's immediate future. That is Gaza's foreseeable future, because everyone who can control Gaza's fate, the Islamist ideologies that have Palestinian politics in their grip, who want Israel's destruction rather than any kind of independence, and therefore unite Israelis against them, are holding Gaza as their front line. And so that is the future of Gaza. It'll be sometimes a little hotter, sometimes a little colder, in the sense that sometimes the Israelis will launch operations into Gaza's population centers. They'll have some intelligence about Hamas operating there. Sometimes they won't, and it'll just be a stalemate. But it won't be anything other than that for the foreseeable future. Nobody can explain how it would be anything else.
I mean, if you look at history, Haviv, and I know you love to look at history, and so do I, I'm a big nerd. If you think about the Holy Land during the Crusades, it went through, decades and decades of this kind of existential, ideological, religious war. And it appears to me that we're in a very similar time period in many ways, and that the Islamists, the Hamasnikim, the Hezbollah, they have this historical patience and they're waiting for the drip, drip, drip of torture to, in some way, annihilate Israel. And I just feel like they're taking deep breaths while watching their citizenry, perish because they really deeply believe that it is for the greater good and that these people are perishing, as martyrs. Do you think that's accurate, Haviv?
That is exactly what they say. That is exactly what they believe. Time is on their side. They have patience. They sometimes phrase it as we love death and the Jews love life, and that's why we will win. And what they mean by that is we have faith. We are people willing to sacrifice because we believe in God and God's plan for history. And these Jews, they're all basically secular, or even if they're religious, they're a lying, cheating religion. The official Muslim dogma about Judaism is not pleasant or polite. It is that the Jews received a revelation from God and then lied about it and warped it because that is their nature. And so the Jews are ultimately not going to stay forever, and Islam is the arc of history. Now, how do you give up that idea? How do you admit that might not be true if the Israelis are here for good? The simple answer when you go to history is that you have examples of all of it, everything. You have an 800-year Reconquista by the by the Christian Spanish that removed the last Muslims from Spain, and that 800-year process was not even. Sometimes it was a real religious war. Most of the time it wasn't. Most of the time it was these frontier farmers expanding very, very slowly and piecemeal because of certain economic conditions that prevailed in the two different areas of Spain. And over 800 years, that process happened and never really awakened strong resistance or strong ideologies on the Muslim side. And sometimes you have the Crusades, and I don't know how to put it. During the Crusades, the Crusaders were not structurally, technologically, in terms of deep political culture, any different from the Muslims. And a decent, successful Muslim general or king like Saladin could defeat a fairly incompetent or divided Christian, elite of the same sort, of the same feudal style. The gap between the Muslim world and Israel today, the near Muslim world, I'm not talking about Indonesia, obviously, the gap between Israel and its Arab neighbors and its Islamist enemies is a fundamental gap of competence. The Muslim Brotherhood and these Islamist movements, they're adorable. I mean, they have this, they're like deep believers. They have a kind of profound naivete. They genuinely think that they know God's mind, and all they're doing is acting out God's mind in the world. And how could God be wrong, right? And you might say, well, why? Maybe God doesn't agree. Like, how do you know? Like, nobody's arguing whether God's wrong. We're asking how you know God's mind. But okay, you think you know God's mind. How could God be wrong? The thing is that everything you touch, you destroy. Hezbollah has not destroyed Israel. It has not weakened Israel. It crushingly gutted state capacity in Lebanon. Lebanon is a shell of a state, is on the way to being a failed state. It's hard to get garbage collected in the streets of Lebanon because of the gutting that Hezbollah has done. Broadly, the civil war process, there's a lot of problems in Lebanon. None of them are remotely as big and fundamental as Hezbollah. What the Islamist civil wars have done to Syria, have done to Libya, what the Islamist regime of Iran has done to Iran. There's no reason on earth Iran isn't one of the wealthiest countries in the world today. It sits on some of the biggest oil reserves in the world, and it is a poverty-stricken country because of its regime. And so everywhere that these Islamists, whether Sunni or Shia, actually rule, they drive into the ground. And the Israelis, because they have a basic democracy, all day long we debate how strong or weak our democracy is, but that's a sign of a serious democracy. We have feedback loops, we have competent state bureaucracy, we have corruption trials for prime ministers, we have, whatever you think of the trial, whether you love Bibi or hate him, is secondary. The point is there is a state prosecution. There is an army that has to answer to the mothers of dead soldiers, and therefore generals are incentivized to train the soldiers better, and therefore Israeli soldiers perform better in the battlefield. We have those strengths of democracy. So will they defeat us? we have nowhere to go. Good luck to them.
Right. Okay. So let's turn to Iran, which is kind of the head of this triumvirate that we're discussing in the first half of the program. We talked about Hezbollah, we talked about Hamas. Let's talk about the body that has been the major funder for both of these terrorist organizations. And of course, we know that sabers are rattling on both sides. We've heard, of course, from the Iranian president this week that Iran is now conducting an all out war against the United States, Israel, and Europe, so basically the West. And obviously, Israel is not backing down. And now, after the meeting on Monday between US President Donald Trump and our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we're understanding that there is readiness on this side as well to step up the fight again if needed. So, how do you see this all out war, as Iran calls it, playing out in 2026?
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about Iran right now is, first of all, Israel didn't just defeat Iran militarily. Okay, that was a battle. There's a war. Iran is 90 million people. It's an enormous country. It can afford to lose even large strategic battles in a way that Israel, for example, can't afford to lose them because it's tiny, right? So just that simple point shows that Iran has a resilience that Israel maybe doesn't have. That, by the way, is one of the reasons Israel makes sure it doesn't lose. It has a level of seriousness when it approaches war that we discovered the Iranian regime simply doesn't have. This is a country that has been blustering and saber rattling and demolishing countries from within and organized these mass proxy systems and this vast intelligence network in the Middle East to destabilize everything, but actually is pathetically weak domestically, like unbelievably weak, like unable to actually field an air force, unable to seriously um, fight any serious battle in any conventional sense, literally incapable of it. And that was an amazing thing for everyone on earth, including every Iranian, to discover. If you were an Iranian general, okay, an IRGC lieutenant, I don't know what, brigadier general, and you were going for coffee, okay, on the streets of Tehran. So 2 years ago, you were a big shot. You had brigadier general uniform. You were walking into a cafe, buying a cup of coffee, and looking pretty smart. Now, it's gotta be embarrassing. It's gotta be embarrassing to walk the streets of Tehran in an IRGC brigadier general's uniform, knowing that if the Israelis left you alive, it's because you're not important enough. Like, that's literally the only reason you would still be alive. The scale of incompetence of the regime has been shown. And what that did was it stole from the Iranians not so much their abilities. Okay, they're still a country and they're still big and there's nobody in Iran who can topple the regime. So the regime gets a second chance to rebuild everything. And it'll get a third and a fourth chance. And by the way, that doesn't diminish from the victory of the 12-day war. The 6-day war, if people remember in 67, was followed up by the attrition war of 69 to 71 on the Egyptian front and the 73 war, which was arguably the Arabs' single biggest success for the first 24 hours in all of the years of Arab-Israeli wars. That still didn't diminish from the scale of the victory of 67. So yes, there's probably going to be another attack, another war. Iran is doing nothing but trying to build out the redemption war. But it's not a redemption war on the grand scale of its regime ideology for the redemption of Islam and for proving the Shia are better than the Sunni because the Shia can destroy Israel where the Sunni couldn't. It's not that scale. It's a redemption war for the regime's own honor and for the regime's own competence. Iran's regime has sold the people the promise that yes, they are suffering under sanctions. Yes, they're suffering under corruption and incompetence. Yes, they don't really have any form of democracy anybody would recognize outside Iran. And yes, it's a desperately poorly run economy because the IRGC just owns so many strategic industries as a way of funding the grand ideological war. This is a regime that has bent Iran's economy to the war and forced Iranians to live as an impoverished people. Yes, all of those sacrifices are real, but that's so that we can be the spearhead of the redemption of Islam. And the incompetence of the regime shown in the 12-day war robbed them of that story, robbed them of the story that is their deepest justification for their very existence and for the suffering they put the Iranian population through. And now they have to at least try to reclaim that story. So if an Iranian president gets up and declares that he's at war with the whole entirety of the universe, that is how you talk when you're on your way out. It has been noted by historians often that empires on their way down is when they build the monumental buildings, when they build the grand constructions. the Colosseum of Rome, the Parthenon in Athens. These were built by great leaders in moments of terrible danger, but always when in looking back, you can tell that the empire was beginning its downfall. And so the Iranians know that they're deeply destabilized. Their very story and legitimation is no longer obvious. And that is going to shape them going forward. They have to reclaim honor just to stabilize the regime's own narrative from within. And that means they have to win. So there's going to be a lot of Iranian attempts at espionage. Israel showed what was possible with spies on the ground. And since then, how many times have we reported this Shabak catching Iranian attempts to...
Weekly, if not every other day, for sure. And it's
Iran has
often
attempted
random Haredim,
dozens of
young
times.
students.
Right.
It's crazy.
There is a massive Iranian effort to mobilize and operate human spies within Israel for money, just for cash. It's got to be Israelis willing to just take cash to spy on army bases. That's not very high-level human intelligence. That's not brigadier generals who have secrets who can tell you where the generals are at any given moment, which apparently Israel has in Iran. But it is nevertheless the beginning of the building out of human intelligence in Israel. They're going to have to work on cyber, doubling, tripling down. There are pieces of the Iranian regime that are not incompetent, that are capable of driving these things. And they're now working overtime to try and impose costs on Israel. And at the end of the day, they have to, for the regime's own stability and survival, show that they can withstand all the things that the Americans and the Israelis did to them and still push forward on the nuclear program, which is the identity. It's a sunk cost problem. They've put so much into it that to admit it was a mistake, the Iranian people has paid too high a cost for that nuclear program for the regime to ever pretend like it was all a mistake and pivot away from it. And so they're going to double down on it. And so we have to expect military action. More than that, we have to expect all of the cyber espionage, long distance kind of stuff that we've seen. That will all escalate. I don't think this was a clever prediction. Everyone's predicting it. I'm just saying, expect it. It's going to be big. It's going to be dramatic. It's going to continue. It's going to escalate.
Okay, let's go to a short break.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers, wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. So Haviv began the program with laying out 3 of his projections for 2026. We're talking about grinding escalation in the north, a Gaza stalemate, and the Israel-Iran war, moving to a bit of a different playing field, or at least stepping up in the espionage playing field. Now, in this half of the program, we're going to slightly pivot to more domestic concerns. So let's begin with what Haviv proposed, and that is Israel begins weaning itself off of U.S. aid. And of course, very recently, just last week, I believe, our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a huge announcement saying that Israel is now going to start producing much more of its own weaponry domestically. This is something, Haviv, that you and I discussed, I can't even remember, maybe a year and a half ago, pretty early on in the war, when we were talking about, just how much Israel was going through in this Gaza front. And it's something that has puzzled me for so long. Why doesn't Israel have much more production inside the country? So just to begin with, let's talk about weaponry aid from the U.S. I assume that's in your constellation of what Israel needs to wean itself off of. Is that true?
It needs to wean itself off of dependence, and it needs to be able to produce domestically the smart stuff, the stuff that gives it the special capabilities. Um, the missiles that go far, the ballistic missiles, the smart packages that can drop bombs very precisely. If it doesn't have access to American versions of that, which is what it buys today, then it will have to bomb less precisely. And its enemies will incur larger civilian costs, but also it'll get things done less well. It'll take more bombs, it'll take more sorties, it'll be more difficult to do the kinds of amazing operations we've seen that are hard to pull off without American hardware in places like Yemen.
But
So
Haviv, do you
yeah,
think that this is also a matter of asking permission in a way? Meaning, if Israel has the capabilities already in hand, it doesn't need to ask permission to use them.
this was an important lesson of the Gaza war. The amount of leverage that Biden had over Israel. People like me and, my teachers, people I read, so smarter people than me, were arguing that it has to be as fast as possible, as hard as possible to actually cost Hamas a lot without costing Israel too much. And so people like us were pulling our hair out in the 4 months that Biden wouldn't let the Israelis go into Rafah, because those are not 4 months in which Gazans were saved or in which Israeli soldiers their lives were not, at risk. Israeli soldiers were dying, hostages were languishing in Hamas dungeons, and Gazan civilians were still suffering and displaced, and occasionally in Israeli airstrikes also dying in those 4 months in which nothing moved because Biden, basically because of domestic Democratic Party politics, wouldn't allow the Israelis into Rafah. Now, the Israelis had to go into Rafah to cut off the major tunnels into Egypt that were the source of Hamas's missile supplies and weapon supplies and firearm supplies. So it wasn't like this was something that could be avoided. And yet the Israelis had no choice, because I think Netanyahu still had a choice. And I blame Netanyahu for this. My prime minister has agency. It doesn't, he was wrong to wait that out. In the end, we had to absorb a Biden slowdown or stoppage of missile shipments anyway. But the point is, um, in real time, we were horrified that Israel couldn't do something fundamental, not to continuing the war, expanding the war. We understood the war was going to be long and hard and bitter and terrible for Gazan civilians. But the faster it is and the harder it is, the less terrible it is for Gazan civilians, the less is demolished, the less is destroyed, the easier it is to rehabilitate, and the more chance of actually removing Hamas from Gaza. And everything played against. Now, I think, again, a lot of the choices made in this war that made it so long and in the end ineffective were made by Netanyahu. But sometimes because of politics, he's been accused of that a lot. I think it's to some degree true. Sometimes I think just because these were the wrong decisions, they misunderstood. A lot of it was American pressure. And the main leverage of American pressure was that we depend on them for the smart missiles, for the best of the missiles that Israel deploys. So we need to get high quality, high tech missiles produced domestically, and we need to get an enormous warehousing and backup of the supply chain. In other words, we have to store the chips we need, the particular kinds of metals and minerals that we need to actually build out our own domestic production facility. And this is a strategic question of independence, of strategic independence. So that's something that absolutely has to happen. But when I say weaning off U.S. aid, one of the things that's going to start in 2026 is Israel not necessarily weaning off, but preparing the weaning off. What I mean is the cash. America sends to Israel $4 billion a year. During the 2 years of the Gaza war, it was more than that. I think it was something like 5 billion extra. I forget the exact details. We published the exact details. It's something like 5 billion extra a year for 2 years, a lot of it in missiles. But it's basically 4 billion a year. We have to prepare for it to go away. Not because we want it to go away, but because American domestic politics are lining up both on left and right. If you watch what J.D. Vance has been saying on this issue, you understand this is quite likely to be the future of the Republican Party as well, not just the Democratic Party, that America doesn't want to spend that money on Israel. Now, there's something, I'm just going to be blunt, and I apologize to my American friends. I say this with a deep love of America. There's something profoundly stupid and foolish in the way this debate is happening in America. America hands Israel $4 billion a year. Well over 90% of it has to be spent in America. Okay, this brings jobs back to America. This makes jobs in American factories. Israel's not allowed to spend it on Israeli companies in Israel. That's A. B, America buys with this money some really phenomenally important things that benefit America elsewhere in the American defense industry. For example, it is because Israel buys American systems, a lot of it because of this money, because that's the only thing they can buy with this money. These American systems are deployed in the Middle East and prove themselves. So America's defense manufacturers are in real competition throughout the world with the Chinese defense manufacturers, with the French defense manufacturers. The French have amazing fighter jets and artillery systems. And nobody is as proven as the American systems because of Israel. If you buy F-35s and F-16s and a couple of refueling systems, again, bought from America, you can conduct the 12-day war over Iran if you so choose. You can't do that with French systems, or if you can, nobody's ever tried. Nobody knows they can. You know you can with the American systems. On missile defense, the American funding of Iron Dome means that America, because it's in the contract of the funding, because the Pentagon aren't suckers, America owns Iron Dome with Israel. It can deploy it right now in South Korea if it wants to. It's a system and a strategic option. So what America buys with the aid to Israel is enormous. There's an ROI to those $4 billion. And it's even bigger than that, which is that America spends $60 billion a year. Folks, look it up, on European defense. Almost all of it in deployments, which means it's not spent back in the American economy. It's spent in Europe. And Israel, I'll finish with this little rant, I apologize. Before Israel goes to America to ask for help, it was already spending 5% of its GDP, of its total GDP, on defense. Israel spends through the nose on defense, way more than America spends on defense. America, I think, spends 3.5% on defense, and then asks America for help. In Europe, the average spending on defense is 1.9% of GDP. The Europeans spend almost half of what America spends and then make sure America pays for their own defense so they have more money for healthcare. Now, if Americans are okay with that relationship in Europe, but Israel is a problem, the 15-fold what they spend in Europe on this vastly wealthy country, the continent that simply doesn't feel like spending on its own defense, then really this conversation in America has turned America into a bunch of suckers. You want to take away the Israeli $4 billion? You get a lot for it. Take it away. And by the way, if you regret the loss, come back 2 years later. We'll still be very grateful and very pro-American and profound allies who coordinate with you and give you all our intelligence. We will still be on America's side. It's not like Israel would want to live in a world that isn't the American-led world. Europeans are laughing at you and spending on their... Okay, so we have to prepare for that loss because American politics on this question, first of all, this is the caveat that needs to begin this, not end this, but it's their money. Like, it's the taxpayers' money of America. Like, they do with it whatever they want. I have deep respect for it. I spend 5% of my GDP on defense before asking for help because I respect the American taxpayer. I wish the Italians respected the American taxpayer that much, or the Germans. But fine, it might go away. That's okay. That's okay. We just have to be ready for it. We have to prepare for it, and Israel is already preparing for it. It's building out domestic production capabilities, and financially, it has to be ready for an increase in deficit spending. Everything we've described so far speaks to that. So, yes.
So let's move to your next line item, which is also, not unexpected. We are going into an election year. The very latest, as I understand it, the elections can be held is something like October 27th of 2026. And that is by law, meaning a basic law. They can break out any time, basically, with 3 months' notice. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Haviv, but essentially the Knesset can de-establish itself, and then within 3 months we can have elections anytime up until the end of October. But by October 27th, there will be an election. And this election is going to be fraught, like basically all of them are. But of course, it is the first election following the disaster, the failures of October 7th, 2023. So, Haviv, how do you see this playing out?
Yes. As you said, October 27 is the deadline for an election, legal deadline, but the Knesset can dissolve itself any day that it can hold a vote, so other than the weekend. This will be an election that will be more visceral than previous ones. And I know that sounds like a high bar because Israeli elections are very hard-fought and visceral. But this was a government that won back in December 2022 without the popular vote. Less than 50% of Israelis voted for the five parties of the coalition that actually formed the government in December 2022, and then embarked on incredibly controversial, the judicial reform that really set Israel on fire and deeply sort of swallowed up all other agendas, and set the course for a government that has been amazingly bitter and destabilizing in so many ways. And you know what? Come at me, people. If you think that Ben Gvir running the police, we have so many data points from within the coalition that talks about how horrified Netanyahu is at Ben Gvir's managing of the police. Crime is through the roof. Don't come at me until you've looked it up. Don't come at me until you've looked it up. Crime is through the roof, and nobody in this government cares. This is a country that went into a 2-year war where the enemy's fundamental strategy was information war. That was Hamas won the war they fought. They did not fight a ground war. They booby-trapped all of Gaza. They booby-trapped a third of the buildings in some cities that the IDF went into, and that's why the buildings were demolished at scale after losing the first few batches of soldiers that tried to walk into these buildings. But they did not stand and fight. They hid in their tunnels. And the war they were actually fighting was the information war. And they had a lot of collaborators, including mainstream media that now, criticizing the war is incredibly important. There are thousands of dead civilians, including children, tens of thousands. And yet, nevertheless, mainstream media in the West constantly and repeatedly and systemically reported errors, mistakes, and outright fabrications. When they could have just reported the real suffering, which is real. And so there was this massive information war that the enemy fought. This is a government that never bothered to establish any kind of information war response to get Israel's literal answers out in real time over 2 years. Years. Amanda, who's Prime Minister Netanyahu's English language spokesperson?
David Mercer.
And have you talked to him? Who
I've
has
never
talked to him?
spoken with him. No.
Okay, so you know what? Cancel this because you knew. You were not supposed to know. Can we erase this part? I'll put it this way, to the point where almost nobody knows who Netanyahu's English language spokesperson is, and nobody cares. And, we have a foreign ministry that has done almost nothing in this war to take on that challenge of information war. And so this is a government that one thing after another, thank God it has a minister of heritage in charge of everybody's heritage. But it doesn't have a minister of diplomacy or information war or public diplomacy. That ministry was actually shut down at the start of the war. So the incompetence on so many fronts. Prime Minister Netanyahu put out videos in the December 2022 campaign about the high cost of living and the protectionist import measures that mean that Israelis, this is not a small thing. Forgive me for saying something that isn't about a war, so nobody in the world cares, but Israelis pay 20, sometimes 30% more for every ordinary good at the supermarket compared to the French and the Germans. I'm not talking about compared to the Middle East. I'm talking about compared to wealthy Western economies. And the government in the 10 months before October 7th, despite campaigning on this, did very nearly nothing at all about it. Almost nothing happens in this government that isn't public relations, PR posturing, and never public relations for the country itself. So there is so much bad about this government that is totally independent of the partisan debates, of judicial reform debates, of the war itself. And it's all going to come to a head in the election. Half the country sees it, and half the country is deeply set against it and feels like it has so many data points to show that this government is running the country into the ground. And half the country, half give or take 20%, right? We don't know exactly who and who's going to stay home. Half the country is deeply committed and loyal to that side of represented by the coalition because they're absolutely convinced that if the opposition takes power, their needs are going to be shunted aside completely and in ways that are going to be deeply destructive to them. For example, the Haredi community. The Haredi community depends on massive welfare payouts to the Haredi municipalities, to Haredi institutions. People will no longer have enough food to eat. Now, why is a vast population of Israelis dependent totally on welfare when they're highly educated, at least the education they got, their religious education, and they literally don't have jobs enough to eat? Because there has been this decades-long building out of a special welfare system just for Haredim that is much more generous than the welfare system for the rest of Israel's poor. And so they're desperate for this government to stay in place. A lot of Likud voters look at the opposition's anger at the government's incompetence and say that's Ashkenazi um, arrogance. That's Ashkenazi marginalization of us. And they're not wrong historically, but under cover of that sense of being victimized by that Ashkenazi elite that's been out of power for so long, they're allowing the Netanyahu government to actually be just as bad as the Ashkenazim used to be, and deeply as corrupt as Mapai was at the beginning. So we have these two sides, or maybe it's seven sides, but built into these two large coalitions that genuinely see the other side as the fall of the country, as a profound displacement of themselves. We have 100,000 Israelis, 80,000 Israelis, something like that, who have left Israel in the last 3 years. The exodus began. Some of the numbers, some of the tens of thousands are Ukrainians escaping the war using an Israeli visa / passport because they had a grandpa who was Jewish and that could get them a passport to Israel. And from Israel, they continued on to the West. It's an illusion that these people are Israelis fleeing, they're Ukrainians fleeing. And it's several tens of thousands of the Israelis who have fled, and it begins in 2022. So some of that statistic is an optical illusion, but not all of it. 70, 80,000 of these people probably, and the exodus begins in 2023, not from October 7, but from judicial reform. And so there is this group of Israelis, and they are a brain drain. They are the highest earning, they are the highest educated, and they have options around the world. And they don't want to. Now, when you ask these people, Israelis who move to Silicon Valley in California, Israelis who move to Holland, Israelis who move to these other economies where they feel they have these opportunities, and there isn't. And you say to them, "What drove you out? Was it October 7? Was it the Iranian threat? Was it Hezbollah rocketing the north for a year before Israel responded seriously?" They will always, always, always answer it had nothing to do with Israel's enemies. It had to do with the perception of decline and internal dissolution led by Israel's politics. And so this is an election that feels existential to the opposition.
Right, but it's also an opposition that feels without any kind of leadership. I think in your two camps, model, I think there's a lot of people in the middle who don't want to vote for Netanyahu necessarily, but have nobody else to vote for on the opposition side because there's just no trust in their leadership anymore. We've seen what's happened after their governments, and there's just nothing so far, and everything can change, drastically during campaigning and right on election day itself, of course. But a lot of people I'm speaking with who are very, middle Israel, they just don't see anyone that they would want to put their faith into right now.
I think that's exactly right. And the scale of the failure of the opposition in that regard is amazing. October 7 happened, and the opposition wasn't able to coalesce around any kind of message having to do with that. Some of that has to do with right-wing loyalty. Right-wing loyalty to right-wing leaders in Israel is immense. We should understand it empathetically. It comes from it's very old. Likud has had 4 leaders since the founding of Israel, and it has never, on its own accord, ousted a leader. And so that's an astonishing level of stability and loyalty. Right after October 7, I said to right-wing friends, at one point I was on a panel, and I accused the right-wing representative on the panel. I don't know what I represented. I wasn't there as representative of the left. That was someone else. I was representing the Martian
Haviv.
showing up in me. I accused the right winger. They said, we can't. The left winger said Netanyahu has to go after October 7, and the right winger said we can't. We're in the middle of a war. And I said to the right winger, "You will forgive him for the war. You will forgive him for October 7." And the right winger was shocked and angry and took probably 6 months to talk to me again. How dare I suggest that the right will forgive Netanyahu for October 7? That's too much. That's too much of a breaking of the Israeli ethos and the Israeli social contract. And then the right went and forgave Netanyahu for October 7. The right is unbelievably loyal to its leadership, and that has turned out to be a massive political advantage. Because, for example, Labor had about 10 years in the first 10 years of Netanyahu's return after 2009, when I think it had 10 leadership changes in 10 years. So on the left, you have new parties sprouting like mushrooms after the rain. Gantz is one. There's just dozens of these new parties over the course of any 20-year period, and constant turnover and no stability. Lapid has been the most stable. But Lapid is limited in his appeal to certain class of, Tel Aviv upper crust. And I say that that's a bad thing. An opposition that can challenge the government forces the government to be good. One of the reasons we've seen a decline in Likud's competence and just this petty corruption. Likud is appointing literal friends of ministers to major government corporations in a way Likud never did in the past. It's worth a whole episode on just the details. Not here's why I think this government is corrupt, bah humbug, vote against them. Literally the tiniest little details and just the endless string of them of the corruption that this government has allowed to fester. Dudu Amsalem is the minister in control of government corporations, and his literal buddies are taking over systematically major government agencies. And you have that across this government. Ministers who have no say, no policy effect, no influence, no words, nothing to actually talk about to the Israeli public, but they're appointing their friends. And so it's become this kind of, it's risks falling into a kind of kleptocracy, exactly the way Mapai was in the early years. And that's this Likud. Now, if Likud was more scared of the opposition, more scared of losing on election day, it would be better. They would be better behaved. I sometimes tell Likudnikim, you want the Bibi you want rather than the Bibi you keep getting? Vote Lapid. And then Bibi will need you. He will need that center because you won't be quite as loyal. He works for you. You don't work for him. That loyalty is a bad thing. But on the center left and on the opposition parties, you have the opposite to an extraordinary degree. The Israeli left used to be the hawkish socialist backbone of Israeli competence and Israeli capacity and Israeli success. It built the Israel that would go on to become the success story that we all know. The 67 war, the 73 war, the 48 war, the 56 war, almost every war fought by the Israeli left was a runaway success story in strictly military terms. Don't give me long-term policy occupation. Yeah, sure. History is big and complicated, but in military terms, was a smashing success. What were the wars fought by the right? Lebanon? None of them were successes. None of them were ever successful. And not only the Iran war, by the way, might have changed that losing streak, but that would have been the exception. But it's even more than that. The left did all the expansions, the right did all the withdrawals. The right's own sense that, the right never withdraws, the right isn't going to do stupid things like hand the West Bank over to Hamas. The right is more likely to do so than the left. If Israeli history is any guide, literally every single incident is that.
No, I mean, look at Lebanon, of course, and the withdrawal by Ehud Barak. That was not a right thing.
Yeah, but
That
that
was
also
left.
wasn't an Israeli. That wasn't an Israeli territorial expansion of any kind. That wasn't the Golan or Sinai or Gaza or West
I
Bank.
mean, we were
That was
there
a
for a long
military
time,
deployment.
but we
Yes, you're right.
digress.
Barak
Yes,
is the
okay.
exception in the other direction.
Haviv, I love you so much, and I want to talk about elections with you for the next, 10 months. Is that what we have, basically? And we will, and we're going to do that. But before we do that, I want to get to your final point, your sixth point, and it is about the economy. And you kind of started talking about that with your previous rants. No, I'm just kidding. I love you. I love everything you're saying. But the economy weakening is kind of, obvious, but also counterintuitive because, of course, the Israeli stock market has been going gangbusters for the past 2 years in this kind of what the heck is going on kind of way, as Israel is, of course, getting lambasted on the international stage. So how do you see this circle being squared in this particular topic, the economy?
Yes, the weakening of the Israeli economy is something to expect in 2026. I want to clarify. It's really important not to overstate it. It's really important also not to, I don't believe this is something Israel can't fix or Israel can't adapt to. As we said way back at the beginning, several hours ago when this all began, it is definitely something Israel can manage and in fact turn into a success story. But it's going to be something that is dealt with at front and center at the top of the agenda in 2026. The point is simple. Every single front we just named, Iran, Gaza, Hezbollah, in Lebanon, more fronts, the Israeli Somaliland recognition that has something possibly potentially to do with the fact that Yemen is right across the bay, right? The wars will continue, and that means the massive defense spending, which went up from roughly 5% over these last 2 years to 7%. Israel's spending incredible sums on defense. And that's not going anywhere because these long-distance enemies, because the kinds of capabilities they need, even close by, even in Lebanon, are very, very expensive capabilities, and Israel will be spending that money. If the right wins this election, if it does. Netanyahu is not loved in the public. He does not have, if you ask the Israeli public, he has not gotten a majority of the Israeli public wanting him as prime minister in like several years now. But even if he, by the way, wins against any other candidate, it's still only a plurality and like in the 30s. But his path to a coalition in the Knesset math, to my knowledge, has always been easier than the opposition's path. In every poll, he has not won an election in any poll. He didn't win the election in the terms of a majority vote, but his path to a coalition in the parliament, which in our system is the only thing that matters, has always been shorter. And so he quite likely will win the next election, and or slightly more likely than anybody else, put it that way. And if that's true, he will be desperately dependent, just like he is now, on the Haredim. And if that's true, the spending on Haredim will only grow. The special kind of welfare spending that incentivizes non-work at a mass scale. Haredim started out Israel's existence as a state as 3% of the population. Today they're 13% of the population, and I believe 20%, maybe slightly even more, of the first graders of Israel. For the first time in the history of Israel this year, there were more first graders in religious school systems than in secular school systems. And so the future of Israel is more religious, more conservative. We don't know what conservatism and religion will do. If it becomes a majority, it also has to change, but we don't know. But the point is that the non-working and subsidized by everybody else who is working part of the population is going to grow. You take all these things put together, the non-zero likelihood, the higher than 50% likelihood, I believe, that the American spending on Israel will end, which will cost America more than it costs Israel, but that's the politics, and America will continue to be the suckers of Europeans while not actually buying useful things from the Israelis. Fine, that's their fault, that's their problem. It's quite likely that it will nevertheless happen. All of these mean that the deficit spending will be sustained and will grow, and we'll have to figure out how to satisfy global investors. NVIDIA just doubled down and quadrupled down on its spending in Israel to the tune of tens of billions of dollars for AI. Israel still has a lot to offer the international, but government spending and stability and all this stuff, borrowing costs for the Israeli state, confidence in Israeli monetary policy, in the Israeli shekel, in the strength of the shekel, inflation. Inflation could be something that gets a little bit more out of control because government spending is out of control on non-productive things. And so the weakening of the Israeli economy is something that either the next government, whether it's Netanyahu or Lapid or somebody else, either the next government takes seriously, or we enter a bad time, a time when, despite NVIDIA's grand announcements and despite the PR of the people in power, we actually begin to see serious inflation, serious runaway spending. The Haredi parties have not given an inch so far on any of these issues. The money is almost as important to them as the military draft, and they're not moving, they're not budging, and the costs are only growing because their percent of the population is growing. The weakening of the Israeli economy is something that if we don't deal with in the coming year, we will rue that fact for years to come.
So essentially, we should leave this conversation extremely depressed and looking for another place to live. Is that what you're saying, Haviv? Plus, minus?
No, not at all. If you live in Israel, you will live more years than in any comparable country by GDP per capita. You will live happier, according to polls, according to studies of this stuff. You will have a larger family and more social capital and a happier life.
And better
None
hummus. Don't forget the
and great
hummus.
hummus, and
Yeah.
none of these challenges are insurmountable. None of these challenges are fundamental. We can afford years of low-level war against enemies committed to our destruction. We can afford it more than they can afford it. That they have decided that it's worthwhile to sacrifice their entire societies on the altar of it is exactly why they're so pathetic, and in fact are going to keep failing as societies, never mind just as adversaries of Israel. We can afford it. We can afford the Haredi welfare system until we can't afford it. And then a good thing will happen, which is that it will collapse. And then they'll have to go to work anyway. So, my optimism with the Haredi question is if they resist and resist and resist, Israel will default on all of these welfare commitments and they'll collapse anyway. It's unsustainable. An unsustainable bad thing is a good bad thing in the sense that it will eventually change. The only question is how much pain when that correction happens. And if we are stupid enough to let it drag on too long, it'll be a lot of pain and we will deserve that pain. There isn't a single problem that is existential. There isn't a single problem we can't deal with. My only message from the coming year is that it's going to be a year that demands wisdom, deep policy, serious monetary thinking, serious economic planning, um, actual reforms that matter. I wish we had a finance minister that was less concerned about building settlements in Gaza and more concerned with import reforms so that every single Israeli's supermarket run is 20% cheaper. A lot of Israelis are struggling. A lot of businesses have crashed because the people who own or run or work in the business have gone off to war in Lebanon or Gaza for 200 days a year for 2 years straight. A lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and a government that is deeply, deeply detached from any of that pain and suffering and the priorities of ordinary Israelis. If because of our tribal loyalties at the ballot box, we don't exact a cost for that behavior, we will deserve the pain that follows from bad policy. And maybe enough pain will cause us to, this is, by the way, how I parent. When my kid walks out the door, I say, it's cold outside, take a jacket. They say, I refuse. And then I watch them shiver for an hour. And I'm very comfortable watching them shiver for an hour because nature is doing the work. This is an easy thing for me. I don't have to explain this to them. Nature is explaining it to them. There are,
Listeners, I will just add
yeah,
that he's watching them shiver for an hour in like the worst case scenario, 17 degrees centigrade. So we're talking about like in the 60s or the 50s. So really, Haviv, no, welfare agency is going to contact you right now. I just got you out of that feedback loop. Thank me later.
I have a
But
6-year-old girl who dresses all in pink, but when she falls off her bike and gets a long scrape down her leg, she gets back on the bike and doesn't complain. I don't pick them up. I don't get excited about their suffering, and they're more resilient for it. That's kind of the general Israeli. I'm just saying, feel free to visit Dear Social Services. I'm going to show you how to do parent. I'm very confident in my
I
parenting
call
style.
it benign neglect. That's how
Benign
I parent.
neglect is
That's
what
how I
kids
call it.
need.
That's
That's
right.
called love. That's called
Yes,
trust. That's called
exactly.
faith in your kids' capabilities. Don't raise a kid without faith in their capabilities. Long story short, if this country is a child and this country behaves often like a child at terrible costs to the people living in it and the people dealing with it, then it will suffer. And if this child is a wise adult, then it will prosper. But this is a year where it's going to be very costly to be foolish. And there will have to be political costs and real political capital spent on facing down the Haredi welfare state, on sometimes facing down the Americans, on the Iran. We just saw Netanyahu visit Trump, apparently get what he wanted. But at some point, he might not get what he wanted. But Iran is still going to be there. Iran's going to wait out any American administration. The Islamist tyrants can always have the time to wait out any Western democracy because democracies switch leaders. We have to be wise and we have to face them down, and we have to sometimes face down our allies and friends, and we have to be able to go it alone more than in the past. And we have to do it all at once. And I think we can. I think we can. But our leaders need the kick in the pants to remember that they work for us and not the other way around.
So a year of growing pains and growing up in many ways. Haviv, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Lazar Focus. Please check out another installment soon, but not next week. I'm going away for a week. So next installment very soon. This episode was produced by Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, shalom.